Imagine living in a world only 50 years from the time the Neanderthals first drew the creatures they hunted in charcoal and ochre upon the walls of the campfire-lit caves in which they dwell. Imagine living only 50 years from Nicephore Niepce, capturing the view from the window at Le Gras onto a plate of pewter with a camera obscura. Imagine living only 50 years from Georges Méliès, creating the illusion of a space capsule crashing into the eye of the moon. In terms of video game history, we're only a few years beyond that point, from when a small company called Atari released a simple black and white game of virtual tennis by the name of Pong. And since then, we've seen the rise of titans in the video game medium. Super Mario Bros., Legend of Zelda, Tetris, Sonic the Hedgehog, Pokémon, Grand Theft Auto, Call of Duty, Minecraft, and many more. But you don't need me to shine a light on those games, everyone else already has. No, I'd like to shine a light on some lesser known titles that have fallen through the cracks of history, and are remembered by only a few. Titles that perhaps have something to offer that got ignored in its time. Perhaps you saw these titles on a list of games released for a given system. Perhaps you saw the cartridge or disc on the shelf at a retro game store, or if you're old enough to remember when they were new, a video rental store, and didn't think much of them when you came across them. This series is about those games. In their time, they went ignored, for not being called Mario or Sonic, Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter, Doom or Halo. But today, they are part of the fossil record of video game history, waiting to become Arcade-ological discoveries. And I can think of no better game to start this series than High Seas Havoc. It was the height of the fourth generation of gaming, the original console wars. While Sega and their Master System had failed to compete with Nintendo and their NES in the home console market the generation before, they managed to play their cards right with the Genesis/Mega Drive, relying on accurate and often even improved versions of arcade titles such as Golden Axe, Altered Beast, Ghouls and Ghosts, and Strider when it was up against the NES, and pushing the system's advantages over the Super Nintendo when that system finally showed up. The CD add-on, the superior processing power, the superior resolution, and of course, a cooler, edgier platforming mascot than what Nintendo had with Mario. The mascot was a blue Aeronacyon who could run faster than the speed of sound, and had a nemesis in a Teddy Roosevelt lookalike called Dr. Robotnik, also known as Eggman. He also collected rings, like chili dogs, and could rip off Dragon Ball Z with the power of colorful gems called Chaos Emeralds. His name was, and is, Sonic the Hedgehog. And he became popular as fast as his running ability. Gamers came in droves to Sega's system, just to experience what the Sonic games had to offer. The speed and physics, the complex level layouts, the colorful detailed graphics, the challenging platforming, the games were far more thrilling and edgier than any adventure the plumber had gone on. And everyone loved them. So much so, the first game replaced Altered Beast as a Genesis's pack-in. Of course, with a successful IP comes imitators. Did Sonic? Did he ever? He started a full-out mascot platformer boom that would span generations. Some could run, some could fly, some had guns, some chewed gum.
And I'm all out of bubblegum.
Some were anthropomorphic animals, some were humans, some were machines, some were these things.
Wild Woody!
But most of them had the good sense to not try competing with the Aeronacyon on Sega-branded turf. The mascot platformer boom was indeed mostly a Super Nintendo thing, and PlayStation and N64 once those systems dropped. The games that appeared on Sega consoles usually had a version elsewhere, or were made by Sega themselves. And then there was Havoc, a pirate Phoque-ing who dared set sail on the Genesis exclusively, in an attempt to steal sales from the Blue Blur. He was Data East century into the mascot platformer boom, and he came from a game that of course bore his name, High Seas Havoc, also known as Captain Havoc in Europe and Captain Lang in Japan. I don't know exactly where to start talking about High Seas Havoc, but you know how I often spend minutes talking about stuff related to what I talk about before getting to the main attraction. So let's just start with who these Data East guys are. YouTube's algorithm seems to like long videos anyway. Data East is a video game company of yesteryear, as you probably guessed. In their early days, they were known for arcade titles such as BurgerTime, Bump and Jump, Karate Champ, and Knockoff, all of which would receive ports to the NES, on which Data East was the system's first third-party publisher. As Nintendo became less strict with third parties as the 4th generation came around, Data East began to develop and publish for other companies' systems. They would continue to make games for Nintendo, of course. The Super Nintendo received Joe and Mac and Shadowrun, but SNK's Neo Geo would see Spin Master and Magical Drop 2, NAC Hudson's TurboGrafx would see Bloody Wolf and Silent Debuggers, and Sega's Genesis would see them publish Megaturk and Outrunners for North America, and Fallout develop Atomic Runner, Dashin' Desperados, and of course the subject of this review, High Seas Havoc. Let me just say this right off the bat. From the box art, this game makes it pretty clear that it's trying to sell itself as a Sonic clone. I wouldn't be surprised if some clueless grandparent back in the day went off the description from their grandkid that Sonic was a blue guy who collected emeralds, and bought this game thinking it was one of the Blue Blur's adventures, and didn't find out until it was too late that, like the pirate that Havoc is, this game had stolen their booty.
You're fiddled indeed. Being a pirate is a rented thing. Do what you want, cause a pirate is free. You are a pirate.
Hey, it's on them for trusting the pirate. I will say, though, that the art made for this game is quite appealing to look at. And I don't just mean the box art, I mean the promotional art too. Yes, this game had posters made for it, and they're available in quite high quality too, which makes it easier to appreciate the work that went into it. Striking color and detailed line work. I especially like the backlighting on this one. It makes the game look epic. Even this artwork, misleading though it may be. This looks like the poster to a Saturday morning cartoon. Maybe not a big one that everyone remembers, but definitely one that has a cult following. And possibly a kick-ass theme song in the vein of Bucky O'Hare.
Bucky! Captain Bucky O'Hare! Mutants and aliens and toads beware!
Totally not foreshadowing a possible future review for this series. But back to the game's infamous reputation as a Sonic clone. It's never wise to judge a book by its cover, but even between those pages of ones and zeros, there's quite a lot Havoc seems to be copying off of the Blue Blur, at least on an aesthetic level. The story revolves around a magical emerald called Emeralda, which is under pursuit by the villain of the story, an Adobenine pirate named Bernardo. Yes, that is indeed supposed to be a walrus. Even with the toss, I couldn't tell until I looked it up. Anyways, the map to Emeralda is in the possession of an Amy Rose lookalike named Bridget, who washes up ashore, wow, copying Phantasy Star as well, and is found by our hero Havoc and his sidekick Tide. Bridget and Tide never appear during gameplay, only in the cutscenes. If you're someone who skips opening cutscenes of retro games, you'd be forgiven for not knowing these two even exist until the ending cutscene. Even the manual doesn't mention their existence. Hell, it doesn't even get Bernardo's name right.
Wrong!
So when Bridget recovers, she tells Havoc and Tide about the map and its importance, and the former to hide it in the mountains before the trio begin living in seclusion. Eventually, however, one of Bernardo's henchmen discovers them and kidnaps Bridget and Tide, and it's up to our friendly neighborhood Sonic Knockoff to rescue them. From the start, the player is given 3 lives and unlimited continues to complete the game's 13 stages. And I know some Europeans are gonna actually me, so I'll address that audience later. The controls, aside from the standard start to pause, are Atari simple. Control pad to move, of course, what else would it be? And any of the buttons to jump. Havoc can also do a mid-air kick when a button is pressed while he's airborne, and he can do a barrel roll when the button is pressed while he's crouching. So Havoc does at least have a slightly more complicated moveset than the Blue Blur he's copying, aside from in Sonic 3 and Knuckles, which wasn't out at the time, so I'll give it a pass. Going into the game, and for the first few stages, you might think that HSH is easier than a Sonic game, or at least a playthrough for the good ending of one. There's only one ending to get here, which means there aren't any collectibles to miss because you aren't good enough. Extra lives, which are earned every 100 treasure each of course, come often, especially early on in the game. There's even a collectible worth 50 treasure that's found pretty commonly throughout the game. And you also get a health bar, instead of a system of have treasure on you when you're hit or you die. All that combined with the unlimited continues, will have one convinced that this is mostly a stress-free playthrough, with none of the fake difficulty bullshit that games from this era are known for. And for those first few levels, it keeps up this perception. In the first stage, Cape Sea Elf, there's a spring leading to floating platforms on which several extra lives can be collected, which gives a good opportunity to... how do I say this without the content bots coming after me? Lose 1 life, and then collect more to stock up. And as late as Stage 6, Burning Hamlet 2, it doesn't really pose that big of a challenge. The most difficult thing up to that point is... the level immediately before it, Burning Hamlet 1, in which Havoc must outrun an angry fireball that kills in 1 hit if it catches up with him. By the way, I don't know if this is my favorite stage in the game, but objectively it's definitely the most unique, and I look forward to it on every session I have with the game. You never think that an anthropomorphic object with a cartoony face on it like some 1930s cartoon could feel so threatening. But here we are. Once a playthrough reaches Mount Chester though, High Seas Havoc reveals its dirty secret, a steep difficulty curve, owing largely to knockbacks that give Simon Belmont stiff competition, and precise platforming leading to spike pit deaths that eat up many a life earned in the first half of the game. Get used to seeing those spikes and hearing that death fanfare. You'll be coming across them a lot. I've had attempts to beat this game go from having like 30 lives to hearing that game over fanfare. In getting footage for this video, I even game over at a part in which the devs decided to literally mock anyone who lost. What, do you think I'm kidding? Here's the clip. And no, that's not just an unfortunate crop that just happened to line up. I found the map to this level online. It actually says out.
Capital O, capital U, capital P. Out.
And if you do decide to continue after a game over, back to having 3 lives no matter how far you got. Used up 24 lives getting through the precise platforming, bouncing electric balls, and flying skirine ambushes of Frozen Palace 2, only to die on the boss? Do it again, now with only 3 lives. The further you get into the game, the weaker and weaker of a consolation those infinite continues will serve upon a game over. And don't think that setting this game to easy mode will help you either. As is the case with many of the games at the time, HSH doesn't allow the final level to be played unless the difficulty is set to normal or above. In fact, this game takes it a step further. Easy mode actually ends at Burning Hamlet 1, which, as I've indirectly stated, is only the 5th stage of the game. Of 13. That's literally over half the game you only get to play if you want to get good. Side note, this game has, like, hardly any bottomless pits in it. In fact, I checked through the game maps. I think they only exist in the final level, Bernardo's airborne ship. And even there, they appear to be programmed like spikes. Havoc has the same death animation and everything. Speaking of animation, High Seas Havoc was released on an 8 megabit cartridge. That's 1 megabyte for those unfamiliar with computer terms, and the same cartridge size as fellow mascot platformers Sonic 2 and Rocket Knight Adventures. And I can definitely say that cartridge size didn't go to waste. The game has a bright color palette, as is to be expected from these kinds of games, and there's line scrolling pulled off to give life to the backgrounds. It is often pretty chunky, but it's still cool to see pulled off, including as the waves in the opening levels, and the sine wave effect giving the illusion of haze in the Burning Hamlet levels. The characters are also given some animations that play into the game's cartoony art style. Each boss has frames and animations for attacking, being attacked, and even being defeated. Death animations in particular range from being played straight like the avian boss of Mount Chester, exploding into the tiny avians that make them up, to being comedic like Titan Bridget's kidnapper flying a surrender flag. Havoc himself has some cartoony animations of his own too, such as sand pouring out of his ripped pants when he touches non-lethal spikes, and getting flattened when trampled. I just wish the PSG sound that played over the latter wasn't so grating. But we'll get to that in a moment. These animations remind me of Crash Bandicoot in a way, with how they go for slapstick-inspired injuries. I mean, with how hard this game is, I figured that the devs thought the least they could do is try to make the gamer laugh at their own mistakes. As for any criticisms I have against the graphics, well, I wish Mount Chester didn't look like it should be called Ice Cream Cone Land, especially considering that these are the levels most agree are where the game's difficulty spikes. I get there's only so many ways to make cold locales and mountains look distinctive, but come on. That's an ice cream cone texture. Surely there is a better way to draw rocks than this. The Aurora Borealis looks cool though. Regardless of that one criticism though, I can definitely say the visuals are one area that this game didn't cheap out on. I dare even say, it matches the first 2 Sonic games in quality here. But one area I feel HSH really excels is in its soundtrack. I said in the last video that I think this game's soundtrack is one of the best that Genesis has to offer, and I meant it. The usual suspects to list the best Genesis soundtracks are the games Sega published themselves. Among third-party titles, it's much more hit or miss. That's because a large percentage of the system's library, especially among third-party titles, was composed in a sound driver called GEMS, which is responsible for some of the most infamous soundtracks on both the Genesis and the 32X. Not every GEMS game sounds like shit, mind you. Sega's own Comic Zone and Vector Man are both GEMS games, as are the third-party titles Earthworm Jim and Toy Story. And I think all those soundtracks are bangers. But when a GEMS game sounds bad, it sounds horrid, and especially gave the third-party library a bad name. Sometimes, though, the third-party titles got lucky. A few of them were composed in the Chrysalis sound driver by a guy named Matt Furness, more on him in another video. In the case of HSH, Data East updated their custom sound driver specifically for this game. One of my sources for this video even calls this driver the Data East/High Seas Havoc driver, and said driver only appears in 2 other official releases, Dashin' Desperados and Minnesota Fats Pool Legend. Remember that word for later. Official. And that sound driver makes the game sound damn good. At least from a music perspective it does. I dare even say, if I had known this was a Genesis game and was listening to the soundtrack on its own, I'd have thought it was from a Super Nintendo game, from its uses of that orchestra sample and how well the synths complement it. Like a Gale especially is just so f***ing epic. And need I remind you, Mount Chester is the midway point of the game, so if the middle boss gets this theme, imagine what the second half of the game must sound like. Actually, here's a few highlights of music from throughout the game, so you can be the judge of if this soundtrack is buried treasure, or if you think I should walk the plank for saying it is. I'm sure the devs are proud of this soundtrack too, because there's a whole dedicated option on the title screen to listen to the game's soundtrack, complete with a visual of Havoc conducting an orchestra. It's even animated to the beat of the track that plays. How cute. However, as great as the soundtrack is, it does seem to push the Genesis sound capabilities to its limits. And I don't mean that in a positive way, I mean that more in the sprites disappearing in the Mega Man games due to graphical limitations kind of way. Because while the music seems to be keeping all the FM channels busy, the sound effects seem to mostly use the PSG channels. For those unfamiliar with tech terms, this means Master System sound, square waves and noise.
No way! No goddamn way!
It sucks, but I can't blame the devs. With such a powerhouse of a soundtrack, it was either use the FM channels for some of the sound effects and sacrifice the music at certain points, or use the PSG channels and leave them as Atari simple as the controls. And honestly, I'll take the PSG sounds. I mean, have you heard how the Mega Man games sound? But it's not just me and apparently the devs that love the soundtrack. You know how I said earlier that this game's sound driver only appears in 3 other official games? Well, guess who else loves this game's soundtrack? Bootleg devs. Yeah, this wasn't a topic I think I'd be covering going into making this video, but that's where my research led me. If there were an iceberg meme for High Seas Havoc, I'd wager this would be one of the deeper entries on the list. The sound driver being stolen to provide the soundtrack some weird Chinese bootlegs. You know the ones. Ones whose titles are Popular IP Random Number. And funny thing, I've known about these games for years. I just didn't realize until making this video that they were using High Seas Havoc's sound driver. But now that I do, I can't unhear it. And you probably know about some of these games too. The Lion King bootleg with the zingers from Donkey Kong Country, High Seas Havoc driver. The Pokemon side-scrollers with the ugly off-model sprites, High Seas Havoc driver. Sonic Jam 6, the port of Super Mario Bros. That has Sonic in place of Mario like some kind of bizarro Samari. Yep, That's also a High Seas Havoc driver game. And the funny thing is, I will admit that this may be my bias for HSH's soundtrack talking, but some of the tracks in these games actually sound pretty good, or at least competent compared to the actual gameplay. And when the driver is used to recreate a pre-existing track, as in the Lion King games, well, let's just say you'd expect worse than what these games put out. It is a bit strange hearing the sound driver on Sonic Jam 6, however. The instruments used for a Sonic ripoff, being used for Mario music, in a game featuring Sonic himself.
Looks like it was meant to be.
I guess that's the life of a pirate. You got treasure, pirates are gonna want to steal it. And the treasure in this case was a sound driver. And even I'll admit sounds nice. So, would I recommend High Seas Havoc? Yes I would. I will admit that it does take a bit too much aesthetically from the Sonic games, and that difficulty spike is definitely going to catch people off guard if they aren't expecting it. To that I say, if you go into this game expecting something more akin to the slower Sonic 1 than the faster Sonic 2, there is enjoyment and a fun challenge to be had with this game, along with solid visuals and an excellent soundtrack. Trying to speed your way through this game will only make you hate it. Its stage design and hazards and boss battles are meant to be taken slow. Otherwise... Also, play either the North American or Japanese version. These are the versions published by Data East themselves. The European release as Captain Havoc was published by Codemasters, and, for some inexplicable reason, they decided to remove the game's first level and also limit the continues. I assumed to make the game harder, perhaps in a scheme to sell Game Genies. This is the company who made the thing, after all. I wouldn't usually condone cheating myself because I'm not George Wood, but since this is Codemasters we're talking about... Also, as you would probably guess from how obscure this game is, and also that Data East has been defunct for over 20 years now, High Seas Havoc has never been re-released, which means, at least in terms of legal ways of playing it, your only option is on an original Sega Genesis cart, which commonly goes loose for the 30s and 40s USD. Not the steepest prices out there, but probably more than most non-collectors are willing to pay for a seldom remembered Genesis game. Maybe play the game through a morally correct way first, and then decide from there if you want it on card if you don't already have it. I guarantee at the very least, you won't find the game totally worthless, and that you'll at least love the soundtrack if nothing else about it. I mean, again, bootleg devs trying to steal the sound driver, and if people try to steal it, well, that's when you know it's treasure. And now it is time for the Phoenix to fly off. Until next time, take care, stay safe, be good to each other, stand in solidarity with the animators, and have a good one.